Right, and we are rolling from somewhere in the wilderness between Conway and Valonia, Arkansas. And I'll start the presentation. Right, if everybody can see that. All right, I wanted to finish talking about ecology by talking a little bit about economics and a little bit about what all of this is ultimately worth to humanity. Now, I happen to like biological diversity. A world of rich, diverse kinds of plants and animals and produce like that is really cool. But I'm kind of a hippie, you might have noticed. And when I teach this class, there's always a bunch of business majors in here. Probably some of you are majoring in business. And I always feel like I have to justify this course. You know, it's like, okay, great, you dirt hippie, you love hugging trees and all of that stuff. But we business majors work in the real world. We're, worried about money. We're growing the economy and all of that. What does all of this matter from that point of view? So this is my ecology lecture for Ayn Rand. Think for a minute, just as a thought experiment. There's no really right answer to this, but think for a minute about two different organisms. Here's a Liripoda melanaluca. This is the giant panda. And half of you are probably going, "Aw," right now. The panda has big eyes, and it's adorably cute and fluffy and cuddly, and it's a panda. Which one is worth more to you, and which one would be more worth saving? This adorably cute, fluffy, delightful giant panda, Liripoda melanaluca, or this hideous, disgusting, slimy, nasty sea slug called Dolabella auricularia? Like, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, if you don't feel like opening up your mics, but I'm going to guess that most of you probably feel more friendly towards adorable, cute, fuzzy, cuddly pandas with big eyes than you do towards hideously slimy sea slugs that kind of look like slimy crawling turds with antennae. All right, I'm probably not wrong here. And if it was a choice as to whether you were to donate money to save the pandas or save the hideous, disgusting sea slug Dolabella, I'm assuming you'd probably be more willing to donate to the Save the Panda Fund. Just a guess here. But most people tend not to care very much about sea slugs. Okay, you can answer if you want to, but I'm going to kind of assume I'm right. So assume that everybody would rather save a panda than a nasty, slimy sea slug. Here's why this was kind of a trick question. Dolabella is not only hideous and slimy, it's also poisonous. And you find this a lot in marine invertebrates, animals without backbones, especially the ones that don't have shells. If you are soft and squishy and easily digestible, living in a world of things with teeth, you need to defend yourself. And one very common way of defending yourself is chemical defenses. This is true for plants as well. This is why a lot of plants are poisonous. A lot of sea creatures are poisonous as well. Well, the only difference between a poison and a medicine is the dose. As the Renaissance alchemist Paracelsus once said, the dose makes the poison. Most medicines can poison you if you get the dose wrong. I mean, even aspirin will kill you if you take too many. And an awful lot of poisons turn out to be medicinal if you use them in just the right way in very carefully calculated doses. There's a lot of natural compounds that will kill you if you take too much, but used in the right way, professionally applied, they can save your life. And beginning in the 1980s, people started looking at compounds in dolabella, what these poisons are, and they found some compounds called dolastatins that block mitosis. If you must know, they mess with the spindle fibers. This is review. You should remember what mitosis and spindle fibers are. And they were able to isolate and modify a version of one of these dolastatins. It's called brentuximab vedotin, or if you want, the trade name that it's sold under, at least in the US, is Adcetris. I'm not sure what it is in Denmark. Europe uses different names sometimes. But this compound, modified but first identified in dolabella auricularia, is currently in use to treat certain types of cancer, notably a type called Hodgkin's lymphoma. There are other dolastatins that are being investigated because they also block mitosis. And if you recall, cancer is mitosis out of control. So I don't know how you feel now about that sea slug, dolabella. But what I hope you see that is that even though it looks kind of gross and most people don't feel cuddly towards it, it can actually be quite beneficial. There are people who will survive who would die if it wasn't for dolabella auricularia and its poisonous slime. That's only one species, though. There are about 4,000 more species of sea slug, basically snails without any shell. And they are also soft and squishy in a world full of teeth. Many of them produce poisons as well, and I idly wonder what else we might find. Somebody ought to look. People are looking for new medicines in marine slugs. It turns out that something like 75% of all drugs that we use, even today, are either derived from living plants and animals, or they were first found in plants and animals, even though today they might be made by other means. One example is aspirin. The aspirin that you buy today is made from simple chemical feedstocks, but the compound was first discovered in plants, in willow bark, the bark of willow trees, and also in a wildflower called meadowsweet. That was where they found a compound called salicylic acid that had the property of easing pain and inflammation. So they discovered it there and then found a cheaper way to make it, but the discovery wouldn't have been made if it wasn't for willows and meadowsweet. Here's a gent named Percy Julian, a great African-American scientist, a chemist, who worked out ways to extract compounds from, he did some work with soybeans, and he did some work with a plant called Mexican yam, Dioscorea barbata, that's shown over there on the left. And he worked out ways to take chemicals from soybeans and Mexican yam and convert them into steroid hormones. His work on this made birth control possible. Birth control is basically taking artificial doses of estrogen, which is a steroid hormone. If you don't care for that, he also made corticosteroids possible. Those are the ones that are all injected to bring inflammation down. If you've ever had a steroid shot, I don't know, maybe because of a sprained ankle or something like that, you benefited from Percy Julian's work on extracting steroid hormones from plants like Mexican yam, which they've got simpler ways to make it now, but they used to collect that stuff in Mexico by the thousands of pounds and use it to make these drugs. This is a fungus called Tolipocladium inflatum. Antibiotics were originally isolated from fungi, penicillin and many others. Tolipocladium, a variety of it that was found in Norway, of all places, produces a drug called cyclosporine. Cyclosporine suppresses the body's immune system, and normally you might not want to do that because the immune system protects you from, bacteria and things. But the immune system also causes your body to reject transplanted organs. And there had been some transplants done ever since the 1950s. Most of the time they didn't work very well. The patients didn't survive very long. But cyclosporine made organ transplants practical for the first time, because you could take just enough to keep your body from attacking this transplanted organ and give you a fighting chance at surviving for years after the transplant. There's hundreds of thousands of people who are alive because of cyclosporine. The folks who won the Nobel Prize in 2015 got it for developing new medications from biological sources. This Chinese researcher, Tu Youyou, developed a drug from a Chinese plant called sweet wormwood, Artemisia annua. There it is growing on the right. And her drug, artemisinin, has saved probably hundreds of thousands of lives from the disease malaria. Not one we worry about very much in this country, but in much of the developing world, malaria is one of the big killers. Up until fairly recently, it was killing as many as 1 million people every year, most of them children under 5. One of the reasons why the death toll has been cut in more than half is because of artemisinin. The other winners developed a family of anti-parasite drugs from a soil bacterium. There's that bacterium on the right. It's a weird bacterium that grows in filaments. It's a bacterium that thinks it's a fungus. I don't have more time to talk about it than that, but that's what it looks like in those filaments with little coils. It's called Streptomyces avermitilis, and they developed anti-parasite drugs, one of which is ivermectin. Any veterinarian is going to know ivermectin. For that matter, I think you can go down to the Conway Co-op store and buy it to treat your cows and your horses. It's used against intestinal worms. It's used against, I think they use it for external parasites too, like mites and ticks and things like that. It's also effective in humans against things like the parasite that causes a tropical disease called river blindness, can be treated with ivermectin. So great benefit for agriculture and for human welfare, by William Campbell and Satoshi Omura, who developed these drugs from a bacterium growing in the soil that could possibly be under your feet, even as we speak. So as I've said, something like 3/4 of all drugs ultimately descend from compounds that were found in plants and animals. And there's lots more to be found. And there's many that are in clinical trials right now that are being tested. But maybe medicine's not your thing. Here's a South American shrub called Stevia rebaudiana. Don't know if it's particularly medicinal, but you can make an extract of its leaves, and the extract has no calories, and it's 300 times sweeter than sugar. I actually grew this in my garden one year. They call it stevia or sweet leaf because you can take one leaf, mush it up, and drop it in your tea and sweeten it very nicely. And it's actually sold. The brand names in this country are Truvia and Pure Via, and there's some others. So that is, non-calorie sweeteners are something a lot of people want to buy. So this is a valuable product derived in pretty recent years from this South American plant. I found another one. Kroger supermarkets in Conway actually had this for a while. They might still. This is an energy drink called Runa. It tastes pretty nice. It tastes kind of like a combination of tea and coffee, and then they usually add fruit flavors, and it's pretty good if you like this sort of thing. And it certainly does keep you awake pretty well. It's got plenty of caffeine, and it's derived from the leaves of a South American shrub called Ilex guayusa. It's actually related to holly, if you know that one. The company was founded in 2009, the Runa Company. They make these energy drinks. They buy them from small farmers in Ecuador who can harvest them sustainably. They don't have to kill the plant. They just have to pick some leaves. So these Ecuadorian farmers get money without having to destroy the Amazon rainforest that they live in. And then, of course, the American company hires something like, it's not huge. I think last I heard they had about 500 employees. So it makes jobs in this country. It makes jobs in Ecuador. It provides us with a product that I like. It tasted quite nice and it kept me awake. So it's basically a win-win for everyone because we have a way to use this natural product in ways that don't involve destroying it, in ways that you can continue for as long as you want to. Unlike mining or something like that, where you have to destroy in order to get the resource. They found these are spores of a soil fungus called Pestilodiopsis microspora. And they discovered in 2011 that this fungus is capable of breaking down polyurethane. Polyurethane is a type of plastic. If you've ever had a skateboard, the wheels are probably made of polyurethane because it's very tough. They use it a lot for foam insulation. They use it for spray foam, this stuff that you can spray into like spaces in your house walls, and it foams up and expands and then it hardens. That's polyurethane. There's a lot of products made out of polyurethane, and this fungus is capable of breaking it down. Given that the world is full of plastic garbage, fungi like this may provide a solution. Instead of having to bury plastics in landfills or burn them or let them, go into the ecosystem as pollutants, fungi like this may be able to eventually break them down and maybe even convert them to something useful like edible protein. It is possible that someday we'll be able to feed our cows on protein derived from plastic broken down by fungi like this. Okay, so that's economically useful. This is a weed called false flax, Camelina sativa. It grows in bad soil, so you don't have to use rich cropland to grow it. You don't have to take land out of cultivation for corn or wheat or anything like that. You can grow it on land that's not good for much. The seeds are rich in oil, and the oil can be burned as diesel fuel. Since 2010, the Air Force has been testing a blend of standard aviation fuel with oil derived from camelina. They actually flew the Blue Angels. That's the Navy's acrobatics team. They actually flew quite successfully on a blend of standard aviation gas and camelina oil. And there's certainly no reason that commercial airplanes, for all I know, maybe cars, could run on this stuff as well. Right now, nobody's thinking about this because the price of oil has just crashed. But one of the things that keeps the military up at night is the fact that an awful lot of oil that we have left is in the territory of countries that may not have an awful lot of reason to like us. And this is one of the things that has shaped US foreign policy and military planning. And it might be nice the next time we have to bomb the shit out of some country to have a source of fuel that's not dependent on the goodwill of places like Russia and Saudi Arabia. So it would be nice if we can expand our energy supply with biofuels. And certainly this could be good for civilians as well. It might be nice if you could fuel your car with fuel like this. And I don't know if they're working on it much now because of the way that oil prices tend to shift around, but just maybe this is going to be useful down the road as an alternate source of something to run our engines on. I'll give you one more just because it's cool. This thing is called a horseshoe crab, Limulus polyphemus. It lives on the Atlantic and Gulf coast of the United States. It's not a true crab. It's actually closer to scorpions and spiders than anything else. And here's the cool thing about it. Its blood is very sensitive to bacteria, and specifically to bacterial endotoxins. Do you remember that endotoxins are these poisonous molecules that are part of a bacterial cell? Go back and look it up if you don't. It was back in like week 2 or something like that. And the thing about the blood of a horseshoe crab is the slightest trace of bacterial endotoxins make it clot. So why is that important? Who cares about clotting of some hideous looking crab's blood with too many legs? Like, ew. These are horseshoe crabs that are having their blood being harvested. And yes, by the way, horseshoe crab blood is blue. It doesn't use hemoglobin, the iron pigment that makes our blood red. It uses a copper-containing pigment called hemocyanin, which gives it this sky blue color. And there is a sustainable harvest of horseshoe crab blood. They'll drain some of the crab's blood and then return the crabs to the wild, and most of them survive. And the reason anybody would do this is that this is the most sensitive test that's available for contamination by bacteria. So every batch, by order of the US Food and Drug Administration, I'm not sure how they do it in Denmark, but at least here, every batch of anything that's injected into somebody has to be tested for bacterial contamination using horseshoe crab blood in the test. So every injectable medicine, every vaccine, every batch of sterile saline, you know, the clear stuff that they put in the bags and then, you know, run into your vein through a tube and a needle, all of that stuff has to be quality control tested using horseshoe crab blood. There's nothing else that is as sensitive for detecting bacteria present. So if you've ever had an injection, if you've ever had an IV, if you've ever had anything injected into your body legitimately by a doctor, we're not talking heroin or anything, not that any of you use that, but if you've ever had a shot like that, the safety was ensured thanks to the blood of horseshoe crabs. I'm just imagining you all saying, ooh, ah. So the bottom line is that hundreds of thousands of chemicals are known from animals and plants. We find hundreds more every year. Many have useful properties as drugs. A quarter of all prescriptions that are written in the United States are for drugs that either are or used to be plant products, or in some cases, animal products. Over-the-counter medications include everything from aspirin, which was first discovered in the bark of willow trees, to Sudafed, which was first isolated from a desert plant called ephedra, otherwise known as joint fir, to this topical wart compound that was first isolated from a plant that grows around here called mayapple. And there's lots of examples of this. And the compounds that aren't useful as drugs sometimes make plants useful as sources of food, sources of fuel, sources of industrial products like rubber, dyes. There's a huge number of products that we can get from this incredible diversity of animals and plants that surrounds us. And for the business majors, people who know how to use this resource right, get freaking rich. We can also talk about indirect services. There's a bunch of bats flying around. One American free-tailed bat, one little Tadarida brasilensis, can eat one mosquito about every 10 seconds all night long. Multiply that, multiply the number of 10-second periods in a night times 2 million, which is the size of the largest bat colony in North America, in Austin, Texas, and you get a ridiculously large number of mosquitoes. And in fact, it's been estimated that insect-eating bats save U.S. agriculture at least $3 billion a year in crops that don't get ruined and pesticides that don't have to be spread. And the bats are happy to do your pest control for free. In fact, I know people who put bat boxes in their yards to try to attract bats to roost because bats will help keep down the bugs. Bats help keep down the mosquitoes and things like that. Big one here. These are beehives getting trucked into, in this case, an apple orchard. Bees, of course, are pollinators, right? It's symbiosis, a mutualism. They pick up nectar and pollen from flowers, but they spread pollen from one flower to the next and enable the plants to reproduce, which means making fruit. And pollination adds at least $15 billion to the value of U.S. agriculture. And something like 30% of the food supply in the United States depends on bee pollination, which is why domestic honeybees get trucked into orchards at the appropriate time of year to fertilize the flowers and make it possible for fruit to appear. Honeybees will pollinate apples, all of your citrus, all of your cucurbits, meaning squash and cucumbers and pumpkins, and also melons require honeybees. All of your berry crops, blackberries and blueberries and raspberries require honeybees. Let me think. Many of your herb crops, rosemary and thyme and things like that, to get seeds for the next generation, you have to have bees. Same for onions. To get onion seed, you've got to have bees. And honeybees also pollinate alfalfa and clover, which you don't eat, but your meat does. Those are made into hay and fed to livestock. So roughly a third of your food depends on honeybee pollination. Oh, almonds, I forgot. Very big one out in California is the almond crop depends on honeybee pollination. And of course, there's also the value of the honey and of secondary products like beeswax. Even when you don't directly get a product from a living thing, you can harvest ideas from looking at them. This is one that was actually worked out by somebody I knew in grad school. This is the foot of a gecko. Geckos are probably best known as the corporate spokesperson for Geico Insurance. They are, in fact, real lizards. You probably know this. And they can climb almost anything. They can walk across the ceiling. They can go up clean glass windows. And they're able to do it because each foot is covered in millions of tiny bristles. And a surface that's covered in millions of tiny bristles can actually cling to surfaces very well. On the left, that's a close-up picture of a gecko foot. On the right, that's a close-up of a new material that I don't think has quite hit the market just yet. But my friend in grad school and some fellows of his invented a material that they call gek skin. You can take an index card-sized piece of gek skin, stick it to a smooth glass surface, and it'll support 700 pounds. And you can peel it off easily without leaving anything sticky behind. That's the kind of thing that, marketed right, ought to have a whole lot of uses. Imagine being able to, with a small piece of gek skin, you could hang your giant widescreen TV anywhere and peel it off when you're done, and there'd be nothing left for the landlord to ding you on for your deposit. That whole field of trying to imitate nature is called biomimetics. And there's everything from gek skin to things like sonar that have been developed because we borrowed ideas from this diverse natural world of animals and plants. So the lesson is that preserving biodiversity is often really good business. In this country, liberals tend to be the sort of people who want to protect our natural habitats and our biodiversity because it's beautiful and inspiring. We tend to be the ones that want to go out and hug trees and all that. We tend to treat nature like it's a beautiful little rabbit that must be cuddled and protected. Conservatives in this country tend to want to treat nature like it's this adorable little rabbit that must be beaten to death with a stick because jobs. They tend to treat nature as something that, has to give way in the name of economic productivity and jobs and shareholder profits and all of that. To the extent that I want to get political, I want to impress upon you that it's not an either-or thing. There are ways, lots of them, to create jobs and create useful products and boost the economy and at the same time preserve natural biodiversity. There's actually a lot more that you might think that the corporate tycoon and the tree-hugging dirt hippie can actually agree on. And it's kind of a shame that this is not more widely known. It can be very good business to preserve endangered species. There doesn't have to be this kind of conflict that you see. But the truth is, it's very difficult to preserve any single species. This picture, by the way, shows a chick of what used to be one of the most endangered birds in the world, the California condor, the largest flying bird on Earth. Now, California condors were almost completely wiped out, and back in the 70s, they trapped the very last of them and raised them in captivity, hoping they could breed them and return them to the wild. That's a condor chick that's actually being fed raw meat by a condor hand puppet. That's not an adult condor on the left. That's somebody's hand in a puppet. That's the kind of thing people had to do in order to save the almost extinct California condor. But the truth is, you can't keep doing that indefinitely. California condors eventually had to go back into the wild. And that's because there's no such thing as a single species, really. Every species is part of an ecosystem. And it depends on, other species for its food, for its habitat. It's affected by its parasites and its predators and its symbionts. Every species is part of a vast web. And I've tried to give you at least a little taste of how that works in the lectures for the past couple of weeks. So if you want to save the endangered California condor permanently, which has been successful so far, by the way, they're back in the wild. What you have to do is protect the ecosystems that they live in. So, quick question. Here's an ecosystem. Which one do you think is more worth preserving? Which one would you save and which one would you pave if you had the choice? This beautiful Ozark Mountain scene with lovely trees that are turning beautiful fall colors and delightful shrubs and cute furry animals and majestic rock outcrops and things like that. That of course looks nothing like Denmark because your country is so damn flat, most of it. Sorry, just teasing Casper a little bit in case he's still listening. Which one would you rather preserve? This majestic Ozark Mountain scene or this nasty, mucky, slimy, stinky, mosquito-infested Louisiana salt marsh? Again, you don't have to answer, and again, it is kind of a trick question, and there really isn't an answer to it. This is more to try to make people think than it is to come up with a right answer. And I'll agree that Louisiana salt marsh is not quite as inspiringly beautiful as the better parts of the Ozark Highlands of Arkansas. But the ecosystem of the Louisiana wetlands, right, the set of all of those, marsh grasses and shrimp and fish and mosquitoes and nutria and alligators and everything in that salt marsh. First of all, it provides about 16% of the U.S. seafood catch, especially oysters, but redfish and things like that as well. That's about 1/6 of our seafood in the U.S. They provide furs. There's still people that go out and do trapping there. They provide a lot of recreation. My dad goes out there and fishes all the time. A lot of people like going out and hunting duck out there when it's in season. And people just like boating through it and, recreationally fishing, things like that. They're also a barrier against hurricane damage. If you have a hurricane coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, its waves have to go through miles of salt marsh before they start hitting land that's dry enough that people have built big buildings on it. So salt marshes like that block waves and surges when hurricanes come in. And a major contributing factor to why Hurricane Katrina was so bad for New Orleans is that New Orleans used to have something like 50 miles of wetlands between it and the open ocean. Now, if you go up into the top of one of the skyscrapers, you can see open ocean if you look to the south. Time was that didn't happen. And there's a number of reasons why we're losing our wetlands. But one of the things that made those storm surges so bad was the fact that New Orleans no longer has those miles and miles of salt marsh to protect it. And it's been estimated if you could put a price tag on all U.S. wetlands, the value of the storm protection would come to $23 billion. That is $23 billion in insurance premiums that you don't have to pay. It's $23 billion in rebuilding and replacement costs that you don't have to pay because your land didn't get hit with a hurricane because it was protected by salt marsh. I'm not saying that the Ozarks are not valuable as well, but there's more value in a salt marsh than might meet the eye. Another service that wetlands provide us is purify water. That's an artificial wetland built by a small town in South Georgia called Richmond Hill. They treat over 1 million gallons of wastewater a day in Richmond Hill just by piping it right into the wetlands. So they send wastewater and sewage into the wetlands And what happens? Microbes start breaking it down. Decomposers start breaking down all of the sewage. Plants start absorbing things like nitrogen and phosphorus out of it. And, complex molecules get broken down. And the water that comes out of there is clean enough that it can go back into the environment. Those wetlands treat 1 million gallons of wastewater every day at a cost of about 10% of a traditional sewage treatment plant. So we can harness what the entire ecosystem is doing, all of that nutrient cycling that we talked about on Tuesday, and use it for a beneficial human purpose. And because wetlands purify water and protect storm surges and provide things like seafood, it's a little alarming that the United States has lost over half its wetlands since the year 1900. And my poor home state of Louisiana has lost 2,000 square miles in the past 80 years. Sorry, Casper, I can't convert that to hectares in my head. It works out to roughly 1 regulation football field an hour. That's what, maybe 1 soccer field in every hour and a half or something like that. But it's a lot, and it's a problem that we're losing all of this territory that's actually much more beneficial than people sometimes realize. Okay, maybe you don't care for wetlands. There was a study in 2003 that looked at coral reefs in the ocean. And they estimated that if you could preserve all of the world's coral reefs as they were in 2003, the net benefit to the economy would be almost $6 billion worth of seafood, $9 billion per year in coastal protection, right? All of that insurance money that you don't pay and the rebuilding that you don't do because your houses are protected from storm waves. Almost $10 billion per year in tourism and recreation, because a lot of people like to go diving on reefs, and $5.5 billion from the development of future drugs, like that anti-cancer drug that comes from that sea slug, which would live in habitats like this. Coral reefs are critically endangered around the world for a number of reasons, and if you could preserve them, they generate nearly $30 billion worth of economic activity every year. And then even more important than that is soil, which is an incredibly complicated ecosystem that we actually don't know very much about. But you have very complex food webs in soils made of bacteria, fungi, plants, protists, earthworms, snails, slugs, roly-polies, insects of all kinds. Soil's been called the poor man's rainforest because it's so diverse. We don't really understand these ecosystems all that well, and yet with the exception of table salt and maybe some artificial flavorings, all of your food comes out of soil. And soil would not exist if it wasn't for these ecosystems taking place under your feet. Everything that's in soil, from bacteria all the way to bunny rabbit burrows, all of it is part of the soil ecosystem. And you live or you die by your soil. So a guy back in '97 named Robert Costanza tried to put a price tag on everything that the living world provides. What's the economic impact of all of the life that we've been talking about in this course? Well, in '97, the total value of the world's economy, the value of everything bought and sold, all of the goods and services that people produced and consumed, was $18 trillion at the time. His best estimate of the annual value of all of the goods and services that nature provides for free was at least 32 trillion, possibly 56 trillion, possibly even more than that. it turns out to be really hard to put a price tag on all of this, especially because you have to have, not just the direct benefits of, let's say harvesting timber or something like that, but the indirect benefits like the value of tourism, the value of storm protection, the money that I don't have to pay because I'm not living in a place that's prone to floods. Things like this can be harder to put a price tag on, but his best estimate was at least $33 trillion, nearly double the value of the human economy. Possibly as much as 3 times the value of the human economy, the goods and the services that people make and buy and sell. So really, the biology department ought to be twice as big as the College of Business. And, we should have a building that was twice as big as the College of Business on the UCA campus. Really, we should. I mean, the new Life Sciences Center is nice, but, we should have a freaking skyscraper compared to the College of Business. Yeah. Did another study in 2002. If you could invest, they said, $45 billion in preserving just about all of the wild land and open ocean that was still there, the economic benefit would be between $4.4 and $5.2 trillion in the form of clean air, clean water, sustainable food sources, meaning food sources you can keep on harvesting for as long as you want to, new products, drugs and things like that, all the things we've talked about, you'd get 101 return on your investment. Like, try finding anything you can invest your money in today that has 100 to 1 return. I mean, the bank doesn't even pay you 1% interest these days, and 100 to 1 return on investment is what? That's like a 10,000% return. Like, dang. Which raises the question as to why the world's billionaires and oligarchs are not just buying every last acre of wilderness that they can. Well, there are some that do get involved in conservation. The problem is that most of those economic benefits are what economists call public goods. A lot of these case studies, by the way, I wouldn't expect you to know, but I might test you on what public goods are. Public goods benefit everybody regardless of whether you pay for them or not. Like, if you buy a cheeseburger and eat it, that's a private good because you pay your money, you get the cheeseburger, and you're the only person that benefits from eating the cheeseburger. Public goods are things like clean air. We all breathe the same air, at least if we're all, in the same area. Everybody benefits from having clean air, and everybody is harmed by having dirty air. If you get asthma and lung disease and things like that, if you breathe dirty air. So everybody benefits from having clean air, but nobody's paying for the air, right? Conway Corporation has not figured out a way to install a meter in your nose and bill you for every breath. I'm sure they would if they could. But yeah, clean air is a benefit provided by ecosystems because plants give off oxygen when they photosynthesize, and yet nobody is willing to pay for it. So the oxygen in the air you breathe is a public good. It benefits everyone regardless of whether you pay anything for it. Public goods are not very well modeled in standard issue capitalist economics. So let's say you have a forest of trees and you chop them all down for their timber or for the thneeds you can make for them, like the Onceler in the Lorax. You cut down your trees, you sell your products, you get to keep your profits. That's a private good. You get to keep the money. There are losses when you cut down a forest. You lose soil. Soil erodes away. Erosion might mean that the land is more prone to flash flooding and things like that, especially as runoff water starts cutting channels into the soil and making gullies. You lose animal and plant species that can't live if they don't have trees around. You lose water purification. Those trees can purify water to some extent. But those losses are spread out among everybody in the neighborhood. Everybody takes the loss, you take the profit. And this is kind of the way that hypercapitalism tends to work, raising the question of how bad can this possibly be? And costs like this, which are paid whether or not anybody asked to pay them, are called externalities. So if you are living in Louisiana between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, on the Mississippi River, there are a lot of chemical plants, and oil refineries. And they're the only source of employment in a lot of places. But even if you don't work there, they tend to discharge a lot of toxins into the air and the water. And they are one reason why that stretch of the Mississippi River is affectionately known as Cancer Alley. It's got some of the highest cancer rates in the United States. That happens whether you sign on to take the risk or not. If you're living there, whether or not you like it, you have a higher risk of getting cancer because you are taking in contaminated water, air, possibly even food. That's an externality. The people that own the chemical plant don't live there. They don't have to deal with it. They can live in places with very pure air, water, food, etc. They have the option not to deal with that cost. People that live there, they aren't so lucky. They're stuck with the negative externality. When you have something like that where the cost of using a resource is spread around, but the benefit goes to individuals, you have a situation called tragedy of the commons. Commons is the old word for land that a village used to own collectively, where everybody could put their sheep. So let's say you've got some commons, you've got some grazing land that everybody in the village has, and there's enough to support 100 sheep. And let's say you've got 10 families in the village, each of whom has 10 sheep. So they raise their sheep on the commons, and then they sell the wool and maybe the milk or the meat or whatever it is. Let's say one person says, hey, why don't I add one extra sheep? So now he's got the benefit of one extra sheep. He's got that much more wool and maybe milk or something. The commons is a little bit poorer because, that extra sheep is eating more grass, but the cost of having that sheep is spread out among everybody. The benefits of owning that sheep go only to the person who has it. This might sound like a pretty sweet deal, but everybody else is going to be thinking the same way. Everybody else in that village is going to be saying, hey, I've got 10 sheep. My neighbor's got 11. Why don't I add another sheep? And then the next person is going to say, hey, both my neighbors have extra sheep. Why don't I add one? So everybody will keep adding sheep. Ultimately, if this keeps going, everybody is acting in their own self-interest. Everybody's acting just like Adam Smith said. And eventually, though, all of the grass gets grazed away, the soil washes away, and you end up with land that's no good for anyone. Everybody tries to maximize their own self-interest. Everybody loses. That's the tragedy of the commons. And I'll give you a real-life example. That's Atlantic cod. Used to be so abundant in the North Atlantic, people used to say that schools of cod would slow down your sailing ship. That may be an exaggeration, but it is true that cod was a very cheap and nutritious source of protein that's been fished for hundreds of years. This is what they used to use in British fish and chips, for example. The Atlantic cod is off the coast of Canada, but it's the same species as the Norwegian cods that they still do fish off the coast of Norway. But here's what happened to the Canadian cod. Fishermen did what economic theory says they ought to do. They fished for cod. They made a lot of money. The best ones used their profits to invest in more boats so they could fish more cod and make even more money. They invested their profits in bigger boats. When the technology came along, they invested in refrigerated boats, boats with refrigerated cargo holds that would let them sail farther away from shore instead of having to come back every day because they couldn't save their catch. They could stay out at sea for weeks fishing and fishing and fishing round the clock because they now had a way to store their catch in these refrigerated compartments. Then after World War II, when the technology came along, they made more and more money. They invested that money in things like sonar, which could be used to find schools of fish. The really big ones started investing in these enormous ships that are basically giant floating factories. They could fish enormous amounts of cod and process it and turn it into frozen fish sticks right on board the damn ship. And there's your result. In 1505, there were an estimated 7 million tons of Atlantic cod available. In 1992, the Canadian government had to shut down the Atlantic cod fishery. Stocks crashed in the 70s and again in the 90s, and they were down to 1/3% of the cod that they had when fishing started in 1505. Only recently have they begun to try to open it up a little bit. It's taken 30 years for the cod fishery to begin to recover. Now, again, you can still buy cod, and most of it is North Sea cod from Norway, and I guess maybe Denmark as well might catch some of this stuff, which hasn't been hurt as bad. But the Canadian Atlantic cod fishery had to be closed, and an entire way of life had to be put on hold. And, people who'd been fishing all of their lives and were good at it but didn't know how to do anything else suddenly had to give up their way of life and live on welfare or try to retrain. It was a real trauma that's affected an entire generation up there. I mean, the quarantine is bad, but imagine being essentially quarantined from the only job you know how to do for the rest of your life. That's what they had to deal with. And it's because of this tragedy of the commons. Everybody tried to grow their business and improve and do better and do better. And that works for a while until everybody loses everything. That's the tragedy of the commons. Why should we be concerned? I said earlier that liberals tend to treat the environment like it's this cuddly little rabbit that has to be protected. Conservatives tend to treat the environment like it's this fuzzy little rabbit that must be bashed in the head to create jobs and prosperity. The truth is that the economy is a giant bear that will kill us if we don't treat it right. In the past 400 years, the US has lost 98% or more of 27 different biomes. Almost all of our prairie has turned into croplands. That nature reserve in that last lab that you're supposed to learn about is just a few acres of what used to cover all of this part of central Arkansas. All of Conway used to look like that. We've lost virtually all of our old growth forest. I don't think there's any left in the whole state of Arkansas. We've lost our coastal wetlands. We've lost, I'll show you one in a minute that we've lost almost all of. This is actually an older slide. The estimate used to be that Brazil was losing 20,000 square miles of Amazon rainforest each year. It's now more than that because the current president of Brazil has been really pushing development, Jair Bolsonaro. One of the threats to biodiversity is introduced species, species that are introduced from another country, another continent, don't have any natural enemies, and they can outcompete and take over the natives. In Arkansas, the big one is Japanese honeysuckle and Chinese privet and Asian zebra mussels, clams in the fresh waters. Be it said, if it sounds like I'm picking on Asia, be it said that American bluegills are a nuisance introduced species in Japan, the burugiru that we started with so long ago. There are, Chinese mitten crabs are a threat to American seafood industry. American slipper shells are a pest in European oyster beds. European starlings are outcompeting Native American birds. Everything goes everywhere these days, especially since we have faster transportation. And this is one threat to native biological diversity, one threat to all of those 1.8 million species of animal that we've got. Probably the best known habitat loss is loss of tropical rainforest. But it's happened here as well. We've lost possibly as much as 95% of a biome that exists in California called vernal pools. These flatlands with ponds that fill up in the winter and then dry up in the summer. There's actually life that's adapted to live in these places that can withstand drying out and then come back when the rains return. And we've lost possibly as much as 95% of those. Maybe the cure for the disease that's going to kill you might be in some little critter that nobody has thought to look at living in that vernal pool. Maybe not. I don't know. No way to tell. Somebody ought to look one of these days. But it's almost certain that we have lost valuable things without even knowing that they're there. Maybe the cure for coronavirus is some compound that was found or that used to be made by some plant or animal somewhere that has gone extinct, maybe without humanity ever knowing it. When I see biodiversity being destroyed, I feel like humanity is taking its Christmas presents and throwing them in the fireplace because it's cold. Now, yes, that will work. You can heat your home by burning your Christmas presents. Maybe we should at least wait to look into them first. Maybe. I don't know. I'm just a hippie. Global climate change is real. It's here, and it's the threat to biodiversity. Levels of consumption are here. The U.S. consumes an enormous amount of resources just to live the lifestyle that we take for granted. Somebody worked out that to provide everybody on Earth with a U.S.-type lifestyle, we'd need the resources of 4 more planets Earth, which, of course, we don't have. We've only got one. We're losing species at a rate that is hard to document because, we haven't discovered all of the species that are there yet, and we can't always track the ones that we do know about. The rate may be as high as 150 a day. Now, extinction always happens. Ask the dinosaurs if you don't believe me. There's always levels of extinction. It's just one of those things. But we're losing them faster now. A lot of it can be traced to human activity, and we're losing species before we even discover them. People who work on things like, tropical animals are finding that, hey, this guy who went out and collected 50 years ago discovered a new species of frog. Let's go find it in the wild. Oops, we can't now because that habitat's been destroyed. We're losing biodiversity before we even knew it was there. maybe some of that might have been useful. Maybe what you're going to die of could have been cured by something from some rando plant in some rainforest somewhere that got bulldozed before you were even born. Maybe. I don't know. Could be. And as Dr. Seuss wrote in the Lorax, unless someone like you gets off your ass and does something, starting with a hard look at your own lifestyle, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And I'm sorry I ended on kind of a downer note there. But I hope that instead of depressing you too much, I've encouraged you to try to do something about the world that we're in. Not necessarily to go and, give away all your worldly possessions and go out and live in the trees. We're all complicit in this to some extent or another, and realistically, we can't stop. But there's still time to do some things about the loss of biological diversity, all of this stuff that we've been studying all this time. Maybe we can save some of it. We're not past hope yet. And just maybe we can benefit ourselves. Like a song that I remember from my child as a Gen Xer goes, there's a choice that we're making. We're saving our own lives. It's true. We make a better day, just you and me. And it sounded better when Michael Jackson was singing it. Any questions? Any comments? There's nothing on the chat, but anybody curious about anything? And sorry.
I actually do have a question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, your opinion on like a policy standpoint, for the U.S., what do you think would be a half good solution to this? I know just a tiny fraction of it, but the majority of money spent on conservation in the country is from the Pittman-Robertson Act, which taxes hunters. It's the Pittman-Robertson Act.
Oh, right.
Taxes,
yeah, your duck stamps and all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they play a huge role in conservation, but then they're also finding an increase, like in Colorado, an increase of outdoor activity. Mountain bikers, hikers, everything is actually now detrimental to the populations of elk herds and stuff like that, just because the elk herds are moving with the more people being up in the mountains. So it's like it's almost like we're loving it to death even now. Do you have an opinion on what could be a possible solution to that?
What would be a possible solution to that? Well, okay, humanity, we don't have a choice not to affect the natural world. We have been doing that ever since we were throwing rocks at mammals. And, there is no living thing that doesn't affect other living things, sometimes for the worse. So it's not a question of, it's not a question of, not affecting nature, because we can't avoid affecting nature. And certainly, people, go outdoors and hunt and fish and hike, because they love it. And, that's not a bad thing. And we want to encourage people to realize the value of what they've got. I think the best approach is just going to be sort of what we already have, is just try to, divide conservation areas into zones. As in, set aside areas that absolutely can't be touched, or that can't be accessed easily. Where only, the bravest of, cross-country hikers would go. Set aside some that can be explored a little more easily, set aside some for more recreation and things like that. Have a series of zones that vary in what you can do in them. They're looking at this with fishing, for example. You know, you can't stop fishing. You know, the world depends on the protein that you take from the oceans. But if you can create some areas as a reserve that can't be fished, fish can grow up there, and as that population grows, they'll spread out of the reserve zone, and you can harvest them there. So I don't have any one size fits all solution, but I think it's probably going to be in designating some areas as completely off limits, and some areas that you can mess with a little more, and some areas that you can mess with some more, and things like that. I mean, I don't think we can. There's no way we can leave all of the natural world alone, but there's graded ways that we can protect as much as we can while satisfying as many human needs as possible. Does that make sense, or am I spitballing?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So
Okay.
it'd just be a continuation of the policies that are already enacted.
Yeah, I don't. To be honest, I don't say this very often, but I was really glad about something George W. Bush did. He signed into law what used to be called the Northwest Hawaiian Islands National Monument. And it's this enormous area of ocean surrounding the Hawaiian minor islands, most of which nobody lives on. And it's bigger than all of the rest of the country's national parks put together. And it contains an awful lot of coral reef, a lot of tropical habitat. And is people won't fish there. But I think the hope is that species of fish can grow there and then can spread elsewhere where they can be caught. So ultimately, I think that will benefit commercial interest as well as it benefits, you know, scuba divers and, you know, day trippers and things like that who might just enjoy the place because it's beautiful. So that's my best sense. But, you know, we do have an entire environmental sciences major at UCA that looks at this in much more detail than I can give. I don't know what your major is, but if you ever get the chance, you might take courses there. Talk with Jenny Adams in the biology department, because I think she's the director of the program, and she could give you a lot more insight than I think I can. I mean, what I'm trained to study is rocks. You know, we don't really have to worry about rocks going extinct. Okay, anything else? All right, I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you all for joining me.